Okay, good evening. We are here. We made it. We're a little early tonight, which is nice. The schedule I have set up is actually supposed to be 8:30 readings, but I seem to never make that. It's always 9 or 9:30 by the time I get a chance to start. So, getting started a little early tonight is good. 15 minutes anyway. All right, we are ready for Chapter 7 of Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals. So, let's get into it. Chapter 7, The Shamanic Vision. Ross Solomon is a radio and TV broadcaster who became fascinated by the lost world of the Incas and who set out, like the remarkable Colonel Percy Fawcett, to try to find a forgotten city. Ross worked for BBC Television in Plymouth, and since I also worked for them occasionally as a presenter, I got to know him well. The legend of a lost city in South America dates back to a manuscript labeled number 512 in the National Library in Rio de Janeiro, which came into its possession in the 1760s. This sounds like an adventure story by Conan Doyle. Indeed, Fawcett's explorations provided Conan Doyle with material for The Lost World. But it is actually an account of 10 years of wandering by a band of Portuguese treasure hunters in central Brazil. The manuscript claims that they discovered a deserted city built of huge blocks of stone. They decided to send a message for reinforcements back to civilization, and an account of their discovery was sent to the viceroy in Bahia by a native runner. But nothing was done about it, and the manuscript has been in the library ever since. Peter Fleming, the brother of novelist Ian Fleming, read it there before he set out on the expedition he describes in Brazilian Adventure. It has also been printed in full in Mysteries of Ancient South America by Harold Wilkins. Colonel Percy Fawcett, a distinguished traveler and adventurer, had read the manuscript and set out to find the lost city. In January 1925, he vanished in the Brazilian Mato Grosso in May 1925, almost certainly murdered by natives. There have been many attempts to follow his trail, none of them successful. However, Ross Salmon's interest in lost cities, which he describes in My Quest for El Dorado, owed nothing to Fawcett. After spending the Second World War in the Army, he dreamed of a life of adventure and found himself a job on a cattle ranch in Venezuela. Then he was placed in charge of a ranch in neighboring Colombia. It was there he began to read about the Spanish conquistadors and the tribes they conquered. An inquiry directed towards Indians who lived in the mountains elicited the information that a people called the Inca had been driven to live in remote jungles by the Blue Eyes, white men, but would one day return to slaughter the invaders. Inca sounded as if it might mean Inca, and so the quest began. Excuse me. An assignment working for the BBC making travel films brought Ross to Bolivia in search of an Inca city once known as Cochabamba. Slogging over mountains and along dry riverbeds, he and another Englishman were guided by an Indian youth to the remains of a city now overgrown by vegetation. Old artifacts they found there convinced them that they were the first to find the city. The local Indians were too terrified of the ghosts of ancestors to venture there. But Ross's companion almost died of a fever, and their hope of leading an expedition to Cochabamba had to be postponed. So it was years later that Ross again took up the search in Bolivia. He was not expecting to find a fortune in gold, only evidence of ancient civilization. Making a documentary film in the area called Beni, to the east of the Bolivian Andes, he came upon a great plain that was covered with canals and with hill-like mounds. These, it seemed, were all the remains of a civilization that had now vanished. Every year the plain had flooded to a depth of about a meter, and the Indians had built the mounds to live there until the flood went away again. An American student named Bill Denovan had discovered these mounds from an airplane in 1962. But had immense trouble persuading any academic organization to investigate. Satellite pictures have showed around 4,000 of the mounds, all untouched by archaeologists. Dr. Victor Bustos an expert on early Inca sites, told Ross that the evidence indicated that this mound civilization had been finally driven to abandon the mounds by a great flood. Ross asked if he was speaking of the biblical flood. Yes, indeed, said Bustos. There is overwhelming evidence from all over the world that this planet was engulfed in floods following phenomenal rains about 10,000 years ago. Oh, sorry, that was a quote. It was not a sudden catastrophe, Bustos thought, but a slow inundation that took many decades. Ross asked, quote, was the mound culture founded by then? End quote, and Bustos admitted, quote, maybe there was a culture here that far back in history. It could be they were driven up into the Andes by great floods, and that they founded the first Andean culture thousands of years ago. End quote. Another archaeologist, Dr. Charles Ponce Sanguinis, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, told Ross that the empire of the Aymara Indians had reached its peak about AD 900 in the area of Tiwanaku. It was probably larger than the Greek or Roman empires before it began to disintegrate. I was interested in the Aymara because of the comments Rand Flem-Ath had made in When the Sky Fell. More than 2.5 million people still speak the Aymara language. He had made the interesting comment that, quote, in 1984, Ivan Guzman de Rojas, a Bolivian mathematician, scored a notable first in the development of computer software in showing that the Aymara language could be used as an intermediate language for simultaneously translating English into several other languages. End quote. It seemed that the Aymara language has a rigorous and simple structure, quote, which means that its syntactical rules always apply and can be written out concisely in the sort of algebraic shorthand that computers understand. Indeed, such is its purity that some historians think it did not just evolve like other languages, but was actually constructed from scratch. End quote. Had he come across it, Maurice Chatelain would certainly have read into that statement a hint that the Aymara language may have been constructed by extraterrestrials as a computer language. Ross Salmon found a curious piece of evidence that might be read as pointing in the same direction. At an old Inca fortress called Pucaria, which looked like a great natural pyramid, he found two curious objects. One was a gold Inca surgeon's knife with a flat blade like a crescent moon. The other was a thin breastplate about the size of the cover of a paperback book. Incised into one side was a design covering 16 squares, almost like a game of noughts and crosses. Tic-tac-toe, I guess. The angular symbols are each placed in a square. A young Quechua Indian named Wanaku, who was acting as Ross's guide, told him, quote, it is the language of my ancestors. This is how they sent messages to other cities, end quote. Looking at it, Ross became convinced that it was a written language, even though scholars say that the Incas had no written language. He later appealed on television for anyone who might be able to interpret the symbols, and a Cornishman named Noel Billings of Porteous was convinced that the answer had come to him in a dream. It was, he said, a mathematical language created by brilliant mathematicians, surveyors, and builders. Ross had no further luck in his attempts to decipher it, but it is worth bearing in mind that the Quechua family of languages, one of which was spoken by the Incas, is closely related to Aymara, and if indeed the symbols are the method by which Wanaku's ancestors communicated, then Ross may have stumbled on some sign that Bolivian Indians of the remote past may have possessed a scientific culture beyond anything we attribute to them. The strangest story in Ross's book, My Quest for El Dorado, concerns a girl named Wakchu, a member of the Kalawaya tribe to the north of Lake Titicaca. Her husband, the shaman, had gone to the city to earn money for the tribe, and Wakchu was suspected of having been unfaithful. A council of elders and local women were undecided about her guilt, so the priests announced that they would call the condor to settle the matter. The Kalawaya believe that human beings are reincarnated as condors, and that a particularly great condor is a reincarnation of a famous Inca leader who conquered that part of the world. Ross, who had been invited to film the ceremony, watched as Wakchu was stripped to her loincloth and tied to a stake on the plateau at the top of the cliff. Then the ritual began. A discordant racket of drums, flutes, and tin whistles. The sound reverberated off the surrounding mountains. Ross was quite convinced that nothing would happen. He had never even seen a condor at close quarters. After a while the chanting died down, and Ross began to suspect that they felt that his presence was bringing them bad luck. Then there was a shout of triumph, and against the opposite mountain top the dark shapes of 3 condors appeared. With a 12-foot wingspan, they dived down toward the Kalawayas. There were 2 black females, and the leader, a large black condor with his white collar gleaming in the frosty sunlight. The music was renewed, and Wakchu struggled against her bonds. Then silence fell as the male condor landed. Ross looked with awe at this great bird only a few feet away, as it strutted around like a gladiator. Then, with wings outstretched, it ran toward Wakchu, its beak pointing at her throat. Ross's assistant ran toward the bird and shooed it away. It sprinted down the slope, then launched itself into the air. The elders cried, "Guilty! We must take her own life." 10 days later, Wakchu did just that, flinging herself from the top of the cliff. I saw Ross's film on BBC television with Ross's commentary, and when My Quest for El Dorado appeared in 1979, I lost no time in buying a copy. To my astonishment and bafflement, the version of the Wakchu story was quite different. Ross explains that Wakchu had been selected as a sacrifice. He does not explain to what, and Ross's Quechua assistant Gerardo tells him that the Amatas, priests, have decided to reenact the condor ceremony so he can film it. Wakchu's infidelity is not even mentioned. Neither is the exclamation she must take her own life, and the story ends abruptly as the condors fly away. There is no mention of Wakchu's suicide. The whole story becomes quite pointless, so there is no further mention of Wakchu being a sacrifice. Ross concludes, quote, "Assuming that the Kalawayas do not possess any magical powers to persuade a wild condor to land at their feet, one must look for the reason," end quote, and suggests that it must have been a tame condor. The next time I bumped into Ross at the BBC in Plymouth, I asked him what on earth had happened. He explained that some quote-unquote experts who had seen his film had been convinced that he must have been taken in. Perhaps the Kalawaya had been paid to deceive him. I pointed out that nothing was less likely, and Ross looked slightly shamefaced and said he agreed. It was sad that he allowed himself to be convinced. What his film visibly demonstrated is that there was some kind of telepathic relation between the condors and the Amadas. Ross's mentor, Colonel Fawcett, was less of a doubter. In Exploration Fawcett, he tells how the novelist Rider Haggard gave him a 10-inch high statuette carved from black basalt, which came from Brazil. It was of a man with a plaque on his chest, which was covered with unknown characters. All who held the figure, says Fawcett, felt as if, quote, "an electric current was flowing up one's arm," end quote. so that some people had to put it down. Experts in the British Museum declared that it was not a fake, but was quite beyond their experience. Fakes are intended to be sold as antiquities, and this was nothing like any known antiquity. So Fawcett decided to try an odd and unconventional method of learning about the figure, psychometry. This is the ability that some people possess of sensing the history of an object by holding it in their hands. It sounds preposterous, but was, in fact, subjected to thorough scientific investigation in the 1840s. It was labeled by its discoverer, Joseph Rhodes Buchanan, psychometry, which means mind or soul measurement. The psychometrist Fawcett consulted said that the statuette was of a priest and that it had been kept in a temple with a large eye over the altar. There was much else about an island, continent, and its inhabitants, then of its destruction, then the sea rose as in a hurricane. Fawcett went on to try his idol on other psychometrists and received impressions closely tallying with the above. He now had no doubt that the statuette came from Atlantis. He writes, quote, "However much romance may have colored the tales, the fact remains that the legendary existence of a highly civilized remnant of an ancient people persisted among the indigenes of the continent, and these traditions can be heard today from the Indians of remote places rarely visited by a white man. There is a remarkable similarity in the accounts which makes it reasonable to conclude that there is a basis of truth in them." End quote. Fawcett states his belief, remarkable for that time, that, quote, quote unquote, the curse of a great civilization fell on South America and seems to accept that this was the catastrophe that destroyed Plato's Atlantis. There can be little doubt that a cataclysm of such dimensions produced tidal waves and minor catastrophes throughout the world. Quote, it caused the rising of the Andes, implying that this happened since the last ice age, and brought to South America a white race expert in the arts of civilization. End quote. Fawcett's conclusions were remarkably similar to those reached by Charles Hapgood and Schwaller de Lubitz. The survivors also built cities like the one discovered by the 1743 expedition. Quote, "The existence of the old cities I do not for a moment doubt. How could I? I myself have seen a portion of one of them, and that is why I observed that it was imperative for me to go again. The remains seemed to be those of an outpost of one of the biggest cities." End quote. Why does he say "seemed to be"? The only answer can be because the rest of the city was completely covered by the jungle, like the Mayan ruins discovered by Stevens and Catherwood in the 1830s, which means, in turn, that Fawcett knew where to look for a lost city. It even emerges from his book that he thought there were many. His objective on that last expedition was not apparently the deserted city of 1753. He had heard of clothed natives of European appearance who avoided all contact with the outside world. Quote, "Our destination on the next expedition, I call it Z for the sake of convenience, is a city reputed to be inhabited possibly by some of those timid people." End quote. And so in January 1925 he left England once more for South America and vanished into its jungles. His book Exploration Fawcett was written before he set out. 300 miles to the west of the home of the Kalawaya Indians lies the desert plains of Nazca, whose surface is covered with drawings of giant birds and animals, and straight lines and geometric shapes that stretch as far as the horizon. First noticed by a Peruvian archaeologist named Zespi in 1927, they remained unknown until Fawcett wrote an article about them in 1940. In June 1941, Dr. Paul Kosuk, a historian at Long Island University, flew above Nazca looking for ancient canals. The lines had been likened to the canals of Mars, and saw the outline of a bird, then of a giant spider, on the red surface of the desert. There was also a condor, a lizard, a killer whale, and a flower, and on a cliff face there was a 900-foot-high figure of a man with his arms outstretched as if in welcome. Kossuth studied the lines and drawings and was later joined by a German student, Maria Reich, who would spend the rest of her life there. She admitted to being baffled by the purpose of the lines, but thought they probably had some astronomical purpose, like a giant calendar. As to the images, her theory was that the Nazca Indians had divided into clans in the days of their economic prosperity, and that these figures were heraldic clan symbols. The lines and drawings were created on the surface of the desert by carefully moving in red-brown stones, and since there was little wind on the pampa, they had remained undisturbed for 1,000 years or so. There was, of course, no way of dating the stones, but artifacts such as pottery and grave goods indicated that the Nazca Indians were roughly contemporaneous with their northern neighbors, the Moche. It took a long time for archaeologists to learn that in the years around 535 AD, some catastrophe had filled the Earth's atmosphere with dust and blotted out the sun, and that a variety of catastrophes then followed for more than a century. No one knows what caused it, although in a book called Catastrophe, archaeological journalist David Keyes argues for a huge volcanic eruption in the area of the Sunda Strait, possibly Krakatoa, although another comet strike remains a possibility. Plague and drought spread worldwide. The Moche were destroyed by the Great Drought, and we may infer that the same thing had happened to the Nazca, and that the giant surface markings visible only from the air were almost certainly a plea to the gods for rain. In Chariots of the Gods, Eric von Daniken inevitably suggested that the lines had been made by visitors from space. That he had failed to look at them at close quarters is revealed by his suggestion that the long straight lines were intended as runways for alien spacecraft. The stones would guarantee a bumpy takeoff. Even in his 1997 Arrival of the Gods, he goes on referring to the lines as runways. Once we know about the Great Drought, the question about the purpose of the lines is solved. But a certain problem remains. Unless the line makers had invented the hot air balloon, how did they see their creation as it was intended to be seen? Perhaps the answer is that they didn't need to. The drawings could have been scaled up from a smaller sketch made on sand using simple tools like ropes and sticks. But one of the most interesting clues is a drawing of a monkey on the pampa, a monkey that is unknown in the Nazca area, but is native to the rainforest to the east of the Peruvian Andes. For the rainforest, as we shall see presently, is the home of shamans who claim to be able to leave their bodies with the help of what we now call psychedelic drugs. One sign of such drugs is a copious nasal discharge. They also cause vomiting, and on one piece of Nazca pottery there is a picture that shows such a nasal discharge and vomiting. In the Nazca area, the hallucinogenic drug is the San Pedro cactus. This interesting fact, which emerged on a BBC Horizon program, could explain the mystery of how the Nazca lines were seen from the air. Space vehicles or hot air balloons are unnecessary. Hallucinogens are capable of creating a sense of flying, which, all shamans assert, enables them to see things from above like a giant bird. In his book Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, the Romanian scholar Mircea Eliade speaks of the widespread myth that shamans are hatched by a giant bird in the branches of the world tree and remarks that, quote, ability to turn into a bird is the common property of all kinds of shamanism, end quote. The shaman has many animal helpers, from jaguars to mice and even plants, and these are his teachers. In From Atlantis to the Sphinx, I attempted to show that this tradition posits a basic interaction between the shaman and nature. For example, Wizard of the Upper Amazon by F. Bruce Lamb describes how a Peruvian youth named Manuel Cordova, who was kidnapped by the Amahuaca Indians of Brazil, again the Upper Amazon, was trained as a shaman. After drinking Honizuma, the vision extract, the natives, including Cordova, experienced shared visions of snakes, birds, and animals that continued all night. The boa chant brought a giant boa constrictor, which glided through the clearing, followed by other snakes, then a long parade of birds, including a giant eagle, which spread its wings in front of them, flashed its yellow eyes, and snapped its beak. After that came many animals. Cordova explains that he can no longer recall much about it, quote, since the knowledge did not originate in my consciousness, end quote. On a later occasion, after a shared vision of jungle cats, Cordova suddenly remembered a black jaguar he had once encountered, and the jaguar immediately appeared, stalking through the middle of the group, causing a terrified shudder. Realizing that Cordova was responsible for the vision, the natives nicknamed him Black Jaguar. In the process of becoming a shaman, Cordova learned to control these drug-induced visions by means of chants. Again, we glimpse the deep significance of music. Cordova described how the Amahuaca Indians were able to lure a herd of pigs into the hunter's trap by a ritual that involved burying a sow's head. A Philadelphia explorer, Harry B. Wright, in Witness to Witchcraft, had described witnessing the leopard dance of Dahomey, West Africa, as a naked girl performed the dance to the beat of a drum and the incantation of a priest. Wright's native companion asked, quote, look, do you see the two leopards walking beside her? End quote. Wright saw nothing, but the other natives appeared to be following the leopards with their eyes, and then in the midst of the ceremony 3 leopards walked out of the jungle and across the clearing. Wright was convinced that these were real leopards, perhaps summoned by the imaginary leopards in the ritual. Also, in From Atlantis to the Sphinx, I quoted the British colonial administrator Sir Arthur Grimble, who in Patterns of Islands was present when a shaman in the Gilbert Island entered into a trance and somehow caused dozens of porpoises to swim ashore and ground themselves on the beach to provide the natives with a feast. The shaman insisted that his spirit had left his body and had invited the porpoises to come ashore. The drawings in Cro-Magnon caves shows shamans wearing bison skins used to be regarded as primitive art until anthropologists recognized that they were part of a shamanistic ritual whose aim was to ensure the success of the hunters. What our civilized mentality finds so hard to accept is that such rituals were almost certainly successful. In Dawn Behind the Dawn, Jeffrey Ashe quotes the anthropologist Miriam Starhawk, quote, across the rich tundra, teeming with animal life, small groups of hunters followed the free-running reindeer and the thundering bison. They were armed with only the most primitive of weapons, but some among the clans were gifted, could call the herds to a cliffside or a pit, where a few beasts, in willing sacrifice, would let themselves be trapped. These gifted shamans could attune themselves to the spirits of the herds, and in so doing they became aware of the pulsating rhythm that infuses all life, the dance of the double spiral of whirling into being and whirling out again. End quote. Although this view of the animal as a willing participant in the hunt may sound bizarre, it is accepted by all shamans. They believe that the animal gives itself as a sacrifice to human beings, like Grimble's porpoises, and since the human being feels the need to give something back, a vessel of the animal's blood is offered and spilled on an altar stone. Sometimes a whole animal is offered. The reasoning behind this is that the hunter who tries to take without giving will eventually starve. The picture that begins to emerge is foreign to our Western modes of thought, yet it can be found everywhere among primitive people who live close to the earth. It is the notion that nature is alive, that certain places are holy, and that the spirits that inhabit such sites need to be treated with respect if their displeasure is to be avoided. We find the same basic insight in a story told by Jacquetta Hawkes in her book Man and the Sun. She points out, quote, the absence of any solar portrait or symbol in Paleolithic art may not mean that the sun had absolutely no part in it. A rite practiced among the pygmies of the Congo warns against any such assumption. The anthropologist Leo Frobenius was traveling through the jungle with several of these skillful and brave little hunters when, toward evening, a need arose for fresh meat. The white man asked his companions if they could kill an antelope. They were astonished at the folly of the request, explaining that they could not hunt successfully that day because no proper preparation had been made. They promised to go hunting the next morning instead. Frobenius, curious to know what their preparations might be, got up before dawn and hid himself on the chosen hilltop. All the pygmies of the party appeared, 3 men and a woman, and presently they smoothed a patch of sand and drew an outline upon it. They waited then as the sun rose. One of the men fired an arrow into the drawing, when the woman raised her arms toward the sun and cried aloud. The men dashed off into the forest. Quote, when Frobenius approached the place, he found that the drawing was that of an antelope, and that the arrow stood in its neck. Later, when the hunting party had returned with a fine antelope shot through the neck, some of them took tufts of its hair and a calabash of blood, plastered them on the drawing, and then wiped it away. End quote. I don't know what a calabash of blood is. I'll have to look that up. Joseph Campbell comments, quote, the crucial point of the pygmy ceremony was that it should take place at dawn, the arrow flying into the antelope precisely when it was struck by a ray of the sun. End quote. In discussing this passage in From Atlantis to the Sphinx, I commented, quote, it is easy to see that the Cro-Magnon hunter using this kind of technique would feel like a modern big game hunter using a high-powered rifle with a telescopic sight. By comparison, the older magic of Neanderthal man must have seemed as crude as a bow and arrow. Continuing the quote, I guess, this, I am inclined to believe, was the reason the Cro-Magnon man became the founder of civilization. His command of magic gave him a sense of optimism, of purpose, of control, such as had been possessed by no animal before him. End quote. What seemed absurd is that it was by the shamanic use of magic that Homo sapiens came to build civilization. For magic turned into science, and science made him the master of nature. In From Atlantis to the Sphinx, I argue that the shaman, because of his magical powers, became the priest king, and was the founder of early civilizations like Sumer and Egypt. The first Westerner to note the existence of shamans was the Russian archpriest Avvakum, Avvakum. I don't know, one of the Old Believers, who in 1652 resisted the attempts of the new patriarch Nikon to bring Russia closer to the Greek Orthodox Church. They were excommunicated en masse in 1666, but 5 years later, earlier, in 1661, Avvakum was deported to Siberia on the Tsar's orders, and there learned of the existence of shamans. On his return from Siberia in 1667, he spent 15 years in prison, where he wrote his Life, which a book title, which became the first classic of Russian literature. Understandably, this dogmatic old believer regarded shamans as servants of the devil. He describes how Pashkov, the head of the expedition, had decided to send his son Jeremy to make war on the Mongols and went to consult the local shaman. Quote, "This villain of a magician," he says, "sacrificed a ram and cut off its head, then began to jump and dance and call the demons." End quote. Finally, with piercing screams, he collapsed on the ground and began to foam at the mouth. He then assured Pashkov that the expedition would be a great victory and would bring tremendous wealth. Avvakum promptly began to pray to God, quote, "May not one of them return, send them evil." End quote. And when in due course Jeremy returned with only one companion, telling how the rest had been massacred, Pashkov understandably blamed Avvakum, and only the intervention of his son prevented him killing him on the spot. Avvakum would be burned at the stake in 1682. His attitude would persist among explorers for the next 2 years and a half, next 2 years, the next 2.5 centuries. In their anthology, Shamans Through Time, Jeremy Narby and Francis Huxley quote a number of 18th century explorer and rationalists who are agreed that shamans are imposters and jugglers. What becomes clear from this book is that, in fact, shamans are basically healers. The term witch doctor is to denote an African shaman is not a misnomer. A shaman is a doctor, but the main difference between shamans and the Western doctors lies in their training. The Western doctor has to undergo a 4-year course at medical school and absorb an updated version of the kind of knowledge accumulated by the Roman physician Galen. But the shaman has to undergo a discipline that is more like that of a medieval ascetic, who flogs himself, starves himself, and spends his nights sleeping on a board. And he does not choose to become a shaman. He is chosen by the spirits, and if he refuses, may suffer death. The torments he has to undergo can be horrific. He begins by losing his appetite for ordinary life and may become deeply unhappy, leaving home to become a wanderer. He becomes indifferent to his physical welfare. In his classic book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, Mircea Eliade quotes the daughter of an Araucanian fisherman of Chile as saying, quote, "I was gathering shells from the reefs when I felt something like a blow on the breast, and a very clear voice inside me said, 'Become a Machi. It is my will.' At the same time, violent pains in my entrails made me lose consciousness. It was certainly the Genchen, the master of men, coming down into me." End quote. And Eliade goes on to speak of long fainting spells and lethargic sleep. There is a painful ceremony which involves apparent death by dismemberment. The neophyte may starve until he seems on the point of death, or lie out in the cold until he is frozen. This period, says anthropologist Waldemar Bogoris, may be compared to a long and serious illness. If he recovers, then inspiration descends, and he learns the art of beating the drum and singing. Knud Rasmussen wrote in 1930 of an Eskimo shaman who told him, quote, "When I was to be a shaman, I chose suffering through 2 things that are most dangerous to us humans:
suffering through hunger and through cold. First I hungered 5 days, and was then allowed to drink a mouthful of warm water. Thereafter I went hungry another 15 days, and was again given a mouthful of warm water. After that I hungered for 10 days. And it just runs out, and then it starts another quote. So, these days of seeking for knowledge are very tiring, for one must walk all the time, no matter what the weather is like, and only rest in short snatches. End quote. All this pain and torment, like the self-inflicted suffering of ascetics, is intended to cause the neophyte to shed the old self and all its habits, and to acquire what Gurdjieff calls essence, a hard core of reality like tempered steel. So shamanism takes the existence of spirits utterly for granted. In this, its attitude differs from that of most Westerners, who may or may not believe in the existence of spirits or ghosts, but certainly do not regard their belief as fundamental to their whole being. Shamans not only believe in spirits, they see them and talk to them. There is no reason to believe that they are self-deceivers who have allowed their imagination to run away with them. They would say that it is our Western view of reality that needs revising. What seems astonishing as we study the development of Western attitudes to shamanism in a collection like Shaman Through Time is how dogmatic and suspicious early anthropologists could be. There is an extract from Everard F. Imtern, who in the late 1880s was living among the Makusi people of British Guiana, when a local shaman called Pieman offered to cure a fever by magical means. Thurn accepted eagerly. After dark, he went to the Pieman's house, which was large but had no walls or chimneys. A great crowd had come to witness the healing. Thurn lay down in his hammock in total darkness, a Makusi boy in the next hammock translating. Then the shaman began with a series of indescribable, this is a quote, indescribable and terrible yells and roars and shouts, which filled the house, shaking walls and roof, sometimes rising rhythmically to a roar, sometimes sinking to a low, distant-sounding growl, which never ceased for 6 hours. Questions seemed to be thundering out, and answers shouted back. End quote. And then another quote. Every now and then, through the mad din, there was a sound, at first low and indistinct, and then gathering in volume, as if some big winged thing came from far toward the house, passed through the roof, then settled heavily on the floor, and again, after an interval, as if the same winged thing rose and passed away as it had come. As each of these mysterious beings came and went, their air, as if displaced by wings, was driven over my face. These were the Kanemas, evil spirits, coming and going. As each came, his yells were first indistinctly heard from far off. This is still a quote. But grew louder and louder until, as he alighted on the floor of the house, they reached their height. The first thing each did was to lap up some of the tobacco water with an ostentatious noise from the calabash on the floor. But while he lapped, the Pieman kept up the shouts until the Kanema was ready to answer. When each Kanema had given an account of itself and promised not to trouble me, it flew rustling away. They came in the form of tigers, deer, monkeys, birds, turtles, snakes, and of Akawoi and Aracuna Indians. And then, incredibly, Thurn comments, quote, that was the end of the quote, and then incredibly, Thurn comments, quote, It was a clever piece of ventriloquism and acting. The whole terrific noise came from the throat of the Pieman, or perhaps a little of it from that of his wife. The rustling of the wings of the Canaima and the thud which was heard as each alighted on the floor was imitated, as I afterwards found, by skilfully shaking the leafy boughs and then dashing them against the ground. Once, probably by accident, the boughs touched my face, and it was then that I discovered what they were, by seizing and holding some of the boughs with my teeth. And that was end quote. Okay. Thurn passed into a semi-trance, and when he woke up, still had the headache. He gave the shaman a 4-penny mirror for his services, and remained convinced that it had all been a fraud. It is not clear how he thought the Pieman caused the voices to come from a distance, then through the roof. He seems to have thought that ventriloquism was the ability to throw the voice, apparently unaware, as any stage ventriloquist could have told him, that ventriloquism requires daylight, so the audience will assume that the voice is issuing from the dummy's mouth. A Pole who was exiled in Siberia in the 1870s, Wenceslas Sirachevsky, had had no such doubts, and his description of the Yakut shamans is wholly positive, describing them as quote-unquote wild and free spirits. And another Siberian exile, Valdemar Bogoris, also approached shamanism positively. He noted that if a young person was slow in obeying the call of the spirits, they were likely to appear in person to ask why. Young people, Bogoris says, are often deeply reluctant to obey. He goes on, quote, "The parents of young persons doomed to inspiration act differently. Sometimes they protest against the call coming to their child and try to induce it to reject the spirits and to keep to ordinary family life. This happens mostly in the case of only children, because the danger pertaining to a shamanistic call, especially in the beginning. The protest of the parents is, however, of no avail, because the rejection of the spirits is much more dangerous even than the acceptance of their call. A young man thwarted in his call to inspiration will either sicken and shortly die, or the spirits will induce him to renounce his home and go far away, where he may follow his vocation without hindrance." End quote. He adds that most of the shamans he knew claimed to have had no teachers, but developed their powers alone. Neither can shamanistic power be inherited. In this they differ from the powers of quote-unquote witches, which may be inherited or taught. This is not to say, of course, that there are not families of shamans, where the son becomes a shaman like his father, but it is the spirits who become the teachers, not his father. The drum is the most basic instrument of the shaman's calling. It seems to induce the state of mind in which contact with the spirits is possible. The Oglala Sioux shaman Black Elk told anthropologist John G. Nyhard, quote, "4 times I cried, 'Hey, ah, ah, hey,' drumming as I cried to the spirit of the world, and while I was doing this, I could feel the power coming through me from my feet up, and I knew I could help the sick little boy." End quote. Willard Z. Park, an American anthropologist who lived among the Paviozo Indians of North Nevada, emphasizes another important aspect of shamanism, the ability to charm game. After the herd has been located by a scout, or the shaman has located it through dreaming, a corral is built, then the quote-unquote charming ceremony is led by the shaman. They all join in a dance which may last all night, and the shaman, under the guidance of the antelope spirit, goes into a trance and sings his antelope song. Then the men, women, and even children take part in the antelope drive, whose purpose is to funnel the animals into the corral. Shamans Through Time charts an interesting progression from total skepticism about shamans through the detached observation of anthropologists like Park to an altogether more involved attitude that would have struck early observers as unscientific. The wider public suddenly became aware of shamanism in 1957 when an American named R. Gordon Wasson described his experience of ingesting magic mushrooms with a Mexican shaman in Life magazine. Wasson and a friend sat on a mat watching the female shaman Maria Sabina through the smoke of resin incense as she prepared and handed out mushrooms to about 20 people. After they had eaten them, the visions began. Quote, in vivid color, always harmonious. They began with art motifs, angular, such as might decorate carpets or textiles or wallpaper. Then they evolved into palaces with courts, arcades, gardens, resplendent palaces all laid out with semi-precious stones. Then I saw a mythological beast drawing a regal chariot. Later it was as though the walls of our house had dissolved and my spirit had flown forth, and I was suspended in midair, viewing the landscapes of mountains with camel caravans advancing slowly across the slopes, the mountains rising tier above tier to the very heavens. End quote. And he comments, quote, I felt that I was now seeing planes, whereas ordinary visions give us an imperfect view. Seeing plane, whereas ordinary visions give us imperfect view. I was seeing the archetypes, the Platonic ideas that underlie the imperfect images of everyday life. The thought crossed my mind, could the divine mushrooms be the secret that lay behind the ancient mysteries? Could the miraculous ability I was now enjoying be the explanation for the flying witches that plays so important a part in the folklore and fairy tales of Northern Europe? End quote. The article provoked a rush of American tourists to Mexico, all anxious to escape the boredom of everyday life and replace it with Rimbaud's quote-unquote reasoned derangement of the senses. Maria Sabina realized she had become a celebrity when Americans began arriving at her door explaining that they wanted to find God. In an interview with a Mexican journalist, she says plaintively, quote, before Wasson, nobody took the mushrooms simply to find God. One had always taken them to heal the sick. End quote. But there was no doubt from her celebrity and the local mayor. But there was no escape from her celebrity, and the local mayor ordered her to put herself at the disposal of a group of foreigners. The problem was that the young groupies who sought her out took the sacred mushroom at any time and any place, not at night, as they were intended to, and she found that these foreigners sucked away some of her own power. But the magic mushroom craze had been launched, and nothing could turn back the clock. Aldous Huxley had started the vogue in 1952 by speaking of the mushroom in his description of his mescaline experience, The Doors of Perception, and two Harvard teachers, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, spread the word in the early 60s. It was Leary's friend Ralph Metzner who invented the word psychedelic, meaning consciousness changing. Leary and Alpert soon left the academic profession, and Leary famously advised his younger contemporaries to turn on, tune in, and drop out. End of chapter. So he finally did mention the Neanderthals again in passing. So there's that. But we have 5 chapters left. I think there are 12 total. We've got 5 left. He's got to cover some ground to tell me about this kingdom of the Neanderthals, because, come on, dude. I am liking the book, though. It's pretty interesting. So, but that is it for this reading session. We'll pick it up again on Tuesday night. Now, I am normally playing Fallout 3 after this, but I finished it. And I haven't picked a new game yet, so I am going to end this session and I will come back with a surprise game. Um, Maybe something I'm already playing. Maybe I'll just randomly pick something that I've already got downloaded. So we'll see. I will catch you in the next stream, whether that's today, tomorrow, or whenever.